a massive jolt happened, and I was awakened, and I looked up on the roof of the plane, and then he came crashing down to the floor.
More than 170 Boeing 737 MAX 9 passenger aircraft after a window and section of a fuselage blew out in midair during a flight.
Of an engine cover that fell off a Boeing 737 operated by Southwest Airlines during takeoff in Denver last night.
A new investigation into the company amid allegations about one of Boeing's airplanes. It's investigating new whistleblower claims made by a Boeing quality engineer about the 787 Dreamliner. The latest claims, first reported by the New York Times, come after a series of dangerous mishaps involving other Boeing planes in recent months.
Just days after testifying against the company, whistleblower John Barnett was found dead in South Carolina.
Wasn't concerned about safety because I asked him, I said, aren't you scared? And he said, and his voice and the way he would talk, no, I ain't scared. He said, but if anything happens to me, it's not suicide.
Just a few months ago, John Barnett held the fate of Boeing in the palm of his hand. After he testified against Boeing after a series of terrifying malfunctions, Boeing shares were tanking. The FAA granted dozens of Boeing planes. More Boeing employees were coming forward with information on how dangerous the planes really were. Boeing was on the verge of losing it all, which made John Barnett their #1 enemy. And on top of all this, John Barnett was also in the middle of suing Boeing because they had retaliated against him. And just as John Barnett was about to give his final deposition on video, John Barnett was conveniently found dead. He had unalived himself. And on the surface, his death made sense. He was old, depressed, he was facing a losing battle against one of the biggest airplane manufacturers in the world. Of course he unalived himself. But when you look behind the curtain, many of the details of his death looks a little suspicious. Like, was it a coincidence that according to his lawyers, John Barnett seemed to be in good spirits the entire week he was testifying against Boeing? Was it a coincidence that the night before his death, he was spotted by a hotel employee eating and scrolling on his phone, and according to that employee, quote, he didn't seem upset at all? Or was it a coincidence that Barnett was supposed to drive home the evening on Friday, March 8th, but Boeing's lawyers insisted that he stay and continue his testimony the next day, only for him to end up dead? Or was it a coincidence that there was a piece of paper, possibly a note, that was found next to him in the car that the police still refused to reveal what the note said? Or how no one has released the security camera footage from the hotel where he was staying at? Or was it a coincidence that just a few months before he wound up dead, Barnett literally told a family friend, quote,
"If anything happens to me, it's not
Are we supposed to believe that this was nothing more than a sad twist of fate that just so happens to save one of the most powerful military-industrial complex companies on the planet from absolute ruin? And why, after the police ruled his death self-inflicted, is Barnett's lawyer still calling for a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death? Is there more to the story that Boeing does not want you to know? Stay dangerous and let's find out. One of the reasons why Boeing has been so careless is because they know that their customers have no one else to go to. See, Boeing's main competitor Airbus is already booked out for the next 10 years worth of orders. So if you need an airplane, you gotta put up with Boeing. And unless your business is in a position like this, you cannot afford to be as careless as Boeing. You need to track your projects, employee hours, and inventory alongside with everything else. And nothing makes this simpler and more affordable than today's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one platform that combines practically every single app you could pay for as a business all under one roof. And when I say every app, I mean every app. Chat, project management, time tracking, CRM, signing documents electronically, accounting, invoicing, point of sale, SMS marketing. You can build full-blown websites with e-commerce or selling courses. You can manage inventory and manufacturing if you're into that. There's a built-in help desk for customer service along with digital phone numbers. Odoo literally has it all for as low as $24.90 per user. Take their document signing app for example, this is one that we use. DocuSign literally costs just as much as Odoo for their standard plan, even though Odoo works just as well and you get all the other apps as well. Or take their accounting app. It's arguably easier and cleaner to use than QuickBooks, even though people pay anywhere from $15 to $100 per month for QuickBooks. And it's the same story for all their other apps. Multiply this by all the apps you're paying for, and you can see how you could be saving hundreds if not a couple $1,000s a year just by switching over. And the best part is that you can try everything for free when you pause the video and click the link below. You can even get free lifetime access to one app of your choice in the Odoo suites, if you don't need the rest. So click the link below and try Odoo for free now. On January 5, 2024, an Alaska Airlines flight carrying 177 people took off from Portland, Oregon. Just minutes into the flights, passengers heard a loud bang and felt a rush of cold air as the cabin depressurized. One of the plane's emergency door plugs had blown off, leaving a massive hole in the cabin. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, and at the time most people assumed it was a freak accident, a one-in-a-million fault that no one could have foreseen or prevented. But it turns out they were wrong, very wrong. The real reason the door flew off was because that specific door panel on the Boeing plane was installed without any bolts to hold it down. Yes, you heard that right. Under slightly different circumstances, 177 people could have died because some genius forgot to put bolts on an airplane door. How does something like this even happen? How does a company as big as Boeing set out a plane without checking if all the parts were installed correctly? Apparently very easily, at least according to John Barnett. See, back in the mid-1980s, John Barnett joined Boeing as a quality control manager at the company's factory in Everett, Washington. It was his job to carefully inspect all the work being done by Boeing engineers and comb through every inch of every Boeing plane leaving the factory to make sure everything was up to code. For 25 years, Barnett worked at Boeing's Everett factory without any complaints. If he found problems in the planes he inspected, he would notify his superiors and they would fix the problems before the planes were sent out. Barnett loved his job. He was proud to work for a company as honest and upfront as Boeing, and he did his job extremely well. In fact, he did so well that in 2010, he was recruited to start working at a different Boeing factory in Charleston, South Carolina. The factory in Charleston was focused on building Boeing's new 787 Dreamliner. And after 25 years of doing the same job, Barnett was excited to move to a new city and work on new planes. But little did he know that he was about to step into a nightmare. In an interview in 2019, Barnett said, quote,
"The new leadership didn't understand processes. They were from the military side. My impression was their mindset was, we are going to do it the way we want to do it. Their motto at the time was, we are in Charleston and we can do anything we want."
And that's where the real problem started. Barnett's new bosses at the Charleston factory weren't interested in maintaining Boeing's reputation or the safety of its planes. All they wanted to do was send out as many planes as fast as they possibly could, and that meant cutting corners. Quote,
"They started pressuring us to not document defects, to work outside the procedures, to allow defective material to be installed without being corrected. They just wanted to get the planes pushed out the door and make the cash register ring. As time went on over the next several years, they started ignoring safety issues and the defective parts. They wanted to just close those jobs out and not research them, that type of thing. Over the years, it just got worse and worse."
At first, it started with telling quality managers like Barnett not to report faults or defects in writing. "We're all on the same team here. Why make our factory look bad by reporting mistakes in writing? Just tell us what the issues are and we'll make sure they're fixed before the planes go out." That kind of thing. Except none of Barnett's superiors had any interest in actually fixing the mistakes the quality managers reported. And these weren't just minor issues. They were major safety risks that were being straight up ignored by management. First, Barnett and his team discovered shards of razor-sharp titanium under several of the airplane's floorboards. These pieces of titanium were left behind by the guys putting the planes together. And under any other circumstances, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. But in Boeing planes, most of the flight's control wires also run underneath the floorboards. Imagine what would happen if a little turbulence caused one of those titanium shards to cut the wrong wire. The plane would become uncontrollable. Barnett was sure his superiors would be just as shocked as he was and that they would fix it immediately, except they didn't. Ripping up the floorboards and all the 787 Dreamliners in the factory would take too much time and cost too much money. They didn't care about stupid things like flight safety. All they cared about was making the cash register ring, remember? So they left Barnett with no other choice but to file an official complaint with the FAA. Quote,
"The FAA came in and did a spot audit. They audited 5 airplanes in Everett and 5 airplanes in Charleston, and they found the metal slivers in all 10 airplanes they inspected."
This should have been enough to get the entire Charleston management team fired. Imagine risking hundreds of lives, all because you didn't want to waste time cleaning up metal shards. But to Barnett's surprise, nothing happened. No one was held responsible. No one was punished or fired. Instead, he was the one being treated like a snitch for making a formal complaint. But Barnett didn't care. He wasn't about to let some military-industrial higher-ups stop him from doing his job. Instead, he became even more careful and thorough while inspecting planes. And more defects just kept popping up all over the place. Almost immediately after submitting the complaints, Barnett and his team came across another issue. In almost every 787 Dreamliner they inspected, at least 25% of the oxygen mask did not work properly. Remember that Alaska Airlines flight where the door flew off? Well, when the entire cabin depressurized, the only thing keeping all those people on board alive was the oxygen mask. Now imagine what would happen if a quarter of those masks did not work. And sure, that Alaska plane was a Boeing 737, and that oxygen mask problem was found in the 787 Dreamliner, but if one Boeing factory could let this stuff slide, who's to say that others wouldn't do it too? A Boeing 737 MAX 9, like the Alaska Airlines flight, can carry a max of 220 passengers and crew. If a flight like that was fully booked and ran into problems in the air, up to 55 people could end up with oxygen masks that aren't working. That means 55 people would die from completely preventable deaths, all because Boeing wanted to save a few $100s. And just like before, Barnett immediately informed his superiors of the issues, only for them to do absolutely nothing about it. And then came the final straw. Barnett and his team discovered something even worse than the titanium shards and broken oxygen masks. See, whenever a quality manager found a defective part in one of the Boeing planes, they would instruct the engineers to remove that part and replace it with a working one. The defective part would then be repaired or disposed of, depending on what was wrong with it. But that was not what was happening at the Charleston factory. Instead, engineers would remove these parts and then would magically lose track of what would happen to them next. And then, those same faulty parts would then be magically reinstalled into the same planes without being repaired. That's how lazy and cheap Boeing had become. And to give you an idea of how serious this was, it wasn't just one seatbelt here or a tray table there, it was dozens of parts that were critical to the plane's body. Parts that would mean the difference between a smooth flight and a crash landing. These defective parts would just be taken off and then just reinstalled onto the same plane again or on a different plane without being repaired. And since no one kept track of these missing parts, if the quality manager for that specific plane didn't notice, the plane would just be sent out to Delta, Emirates, or any other airline as if it was 100% safe and functional. Barnett couldn't believe that a company as big as Boeing could let these kinds of grave mistakes slide, but they did. Every time he filed an internal complaint, he would be ignored. And the more he tried to get people to take him seriously, the more his bosses punished him for doing his job right. Barnett was on thin ice. It was obvious that the only thing his bosses cared about was selling more planes, and that he was the one thing that was standing in their way. But the problem was they couldn't just fire him for doing his job. That would get them sued. So they had to get creative with their punishments. Quote,
"After I filed my complaint, they isolated me from the other quality managers. I was basically by myself. I was in a hostile work environment. Nothing I could do was right. Anytime I brought up procedures, I was told to work in the gray areas of the procedures and find a way to keep production moving."
But Barnett was not going to take this lying down. He eventually sent a complaint to Boeing's ethics departments. This was as high as he could go. Quote,
"They sent me an email and said they had substantiated my original complaint and that they had opened a second investigation against my boss for the hostile work environment. They started a second investigation. That went away. I never got a follow-up. They took no action to correct anything. It just went into a black hole somewhere."
Still, Barnett would not give up. He kept trying to keep defective parts from being installed any way he could, including keeping careful records of every fault he found and every complaint he had. But that just made things worse. His bosses in Charleston were getting angry, so they gave him one last chance to make things right. From now on, if he had any complaints, they told him he had to come to them in person and tell them about it himself. Under no circumstances should he put any of his complaints in writing. That would just make the company look bad if something went wrong with the parts he was flagging. It was too much for Barnett. He couldn't take the isolation and constant punishment anymore, so he did the only thing he had left. He went straight to the boss of the Boeing Ethics Committee. Quote,
"I sent her an email and said, 'I need help. I'm being harassed and blacklisted.' And she wrote back and said, 'We will look into your complaint.' In that email, I specifically asked that my complaints be investigated by people outside of Charleston. The people in Charleston all seem to be working together and sharing information and covering things up. They assured me it would." Within a couple of days, it was turned over to the human resources rep that should have been under investigation, and they gave it to her to investigate. Not surprisingly, she closed it out very quickly, saying she couldn't substantiate my complaint.
All the cards were stacked against Barnett. It was obvious he was fighting a losing battle against his supervisors. But how was any of this even possible? Why, after 25 years of happily working for Boeing in Washington, was Barnett being treated like garbage for doing the exact same job in Charleston? Did the Charleston management team just hate his guts? Or was there something bigger going on? Even though Boeing is best known for its commercial airplanes, that's not where most of the company's money comes from. You see, Boeing is also the third biggest defense contractor in the world, and one of Boeing's biggest sources of revenue is defense contracting. It produces all sorts of rockets, satellites, and weapons for the US military. Back in the late 1990s, Boeing merged with the McDonnell Douglas Corporation. Even though you may not have heard of McDonnell Douglas before, they were one of the biggest military industrial companies in the world. They produced things like the F-15 Eagle fighter jet, the F-A-18 Hornet, they were manufacturing the Tomahawk missile, and now they had just merged with Boeing. Even though McDonnell Douglas lost his name in the merger, it didn't lose its power. Instead, members of McDonnell's cutthroat management team actually pushed Boeing's more level-headed managers out. Unlike Boeing's original managers, the guys from McDonnell Douglas didn't care about the quality of their engineering or maintaining the company's reputation. All they cared about was their stock price. And the easiest way to increase the stock price? Cut costs. They were also super tight with their US military partners, and they used that influence to push their profit-first management style onto everyone else. That included outsourcing a lot of the manufacturing work to other companies, like Spirit Aerosystems, which is where the body of that Alaska Airlines plane was built. And guess what? Just like Boeing, whistleblowers have accused Spirit Aerosystems of covering up faults and defects and retaliating against inspectors who reported them. The results? Boeing went from a company that valued quality and safety above all else to a profit-at-all-cost monster. At the Washington plant where John Barnett worked for 25 years, squeezing every penny out was not the biggest concern. But in Charleston, it was the complete opposite. The management team at Charleston was sourced directly from McDonnell Douglas' old hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. And the plant's main factory is literally built on the same grounds as a joint-use Charleston Air Force Base. And needless to say, Barnett did not fit in. So his bosses made sure he paid for it. John's direct supervisor quote mocked him in weekly meetings whenever he dared to contribute a thought. He assigned him a fellow manager to spy on him and to spread rumors that he did not play nicely with others, end quotes. In one of his performance reviews of John's work, the manager literally blamed him for doing his job too well. Quote, John is very knowledgeable almost to a fault, as it gets in the way at times when issues arise, end quotes. Thanks to Boeing's new policy of see something, don't say something, internal documents reported that manufacturing defects had dropped by 20% in a single year, not because they were actually producing less defects, but because Boeing was bullying its quality managers into staying quiet about the problems they found. But it didn't matter. As long as Boeing kept getting those taxpayer dollars, it could keep on chugging along as is. Even after Qatar Airlines openly refused to accept any more planes built in the Charleston plants, nothing changed. It was business as usual. When an undercover reporter asked Charleston staff whether they would fly on a Boeing 787 Dreamliner themselves, only 5 out of 15 said yes. And even the 5 that did say yes, didn't say yes because they were confident in the safety of their planes. One worker actually answered, quote, I probably would, but I have kind of a death wish too. John Barnett was so concerned about the safety of the 787 Dreamliners, when asked if he would fly on one of them, he answered,
I would change flights before I would fly a 787. I've told my family, please don't fly a 787. Fly something else. Try to get a different ticket.
That's how serious Boeing's issues were. But with everyone at Boeing going the extra mile to keep Barnett quiet, John Barnett was so concerned about the safety of 787 Dreamliners, in 2017 he had reached a turning point. He was having serious health problems and anxiety attacks as a result of the stress and public humiliation he faced at work, so he decided to take his complaints outside of Boeing. In January 2017, he filed an official complaint with OSHA, a government agency called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In his complaint, he listed all the issues he found in the 787 Dreamliners, as well as all the retaliation he faced for pointing out these problems. After that, the FAA came back and said that it had found clear evidence of all of Barnett's complaints, and that it was working with Boeing to get them resolved. But all Boeing had to do to shut down that investigation was to tell the FAA they had checked on all the problems, and that they promised that the problems weren't as serious as Barnett made them out to be. In the end, none of the planes with titanium shards in the floorboards or malfunctioning oxygen masks were recalled. Boeing didn't even have to notify the companies that had bought the bad planes. Barnett just couldn't take it anymore. He had given Boeing 32 years of his life, but less than 7 years at the Charleston plant put him at risk of a stress-related heart attack, according to his family doctor. So in 2017, he finally retired. He thought he could do more good outside the company, where he would be free to warn as many people as he wanted about the danger of Boeing's planes. For 4 years, he spent hours a day talking to reporters, trying to raise awareness about the issues Boeing was hiding, and doing everything he could to support his case against Boeing with OSHA. But in the end, John Barnett was just some lowly quality manager from Louisiana. And Boeing was one of the most powerful corporations in the world, and they had the full support of the US military behind it. And what did John Barnett have? A few emails and written complaints? There was no way he would ever win. With that in mind, It wasn't surprising when the OSHA case finally came to an end in 2021, and they ended up siding with Boeing, not Barnett, despite the FAA verifying all of Barnett's claims. Despite all the safety issues Boeing had between 2017 and 2021, Boeing had won. It could keep making shoddy planes with absolutely zero consequences. But even though Barnett had lost again, he wasn't a quitter. He knew how dangerous it would be to let Boeing get away with cutting corners, so he decided to take one last shot at holding the company responsible. Little did he know this decision would cost him his life. When John Barnett left Boeing in 2017, he opened a separate lawsuit against the company, accusing them of intimidating and retaliating against him for blowing the whistle. Even though the OSHA case was closed, this whistleblowing suit was still in the works. For years after he left Boeing, the lawsuit stalled, but then the Alaska Airlines malfunction happened, and suddenly Barnett was back in the spotlight, warning people about the dangers of flying on Boeing planes.
But my concern is, what's the rest of the airplane? What's the rest of the condition of the airplane? And the reason my concern for that is, back in 2012, Boeing started removing inspection operations off their jobs. So it left the mechanics to buy off their own work. So what we're seeing with the door plug blowout is what I've seen with the rest of the airplane, as far as jobs not being completed properly, inspection steps being removed, issues being ignored. My concerns are with the 737 and the 787, because those programs have really embraced the theory that quality is overhead and non-value added. So those two programs have really put a strong effort into removing quality from the process. When I first started working at Charleston, I was in charge with pushing back defects to our suppliers.
Even worse, more Boeing employees were starting to come forward with their own complaints about being intimidated into staying quiet. To Boeing, Barnett was a 14-year headache that they just couldn't shake. So they vowed that this would be the last time they faced him in court. It was time to put the whole thing to bed. So they started expediting the case. One of the last steps before taking the case to court was to record Barnett's official testimony during a deposition. That meant Barnett would be questioned and cross-examined on camera by both his lawyers and Boeing's, and that would be used as his official testimony in the case. On March 2, 2024, Barnett arrived in Charleston, where the deposition was taking place. He checked into room 511 at a nearby Holiday Inn and started preparing for the upcoming questioning. On March 7, Barnett sat down for the first round of questions from his own lawyers. That session lasted around 4 hours. The next day, he was back to be cross-examined by Boeing's lawyers, who kept him talking for more than 7 hours. 7 hours of cross-examination by an expert legal team is enough to tire out anyone. So it was completely understandable when Barnett said he wanted to drive home to Louisiana that evening to take a few weeks break. But the Boeing lawyers refused. They insisted he continue his testimony the next day too. According to Barnett's lawyers, Barnett was, quote, the best witness they had ever seen, end quotes. His ability to accurately recall specific dates and details from memory was painting him as a trustworthy expert witness, which would make Boeing look very bad once the case went to trial. Maybe the Boeing lawyers thought that if they kept Barnett going when he was obviously getting tired, it would make him finally slip up. Maybe they just wanted to exhaust him to the point of discouragement. But unfortunately for them, instead of complaining, Barnett seemed happy to carry on. His lawyer described him as being in good spirits and looking forward to putting this phase of his life behind him. That night, he extended his stay at the Holiday Inn, got himself some dinner, and was seen by a hotel employee scrolling on his phone as he ate. There was no sign at all that he was upset or stressed. The next morning, Barnett's lawyers arrived at the offices where the deposition took place at around 10 a.m. Barnett had not shown up yet, but that wasn't really surprising. Earlier that morning, downtown Charleston had experienced one of the worst rainstorms they had ever seen. The entire place was flooded, so delays were inevitable. Barnett's lawyer had even called his room at the Holiday Inn at 9 that morning to check if he could pick him up on the way, but Barnett didn't answer. So they waited, sure that Barnett would show up at any moment, blaming the weather for his tardiness. Only he never did. Getting worried, his lawyer called the Holiday Inn directly. Quote, I asked if he checked out, and they said no. I asked to be put to the room, and the phone just kept ringing. So then I asked if they checked the room. The Holiday Inn folks said, his stuff's packed up but he's not there. Anxious over his client's well-being, the lawyer asked them to check if Barnett's car was still in the parking lots. After a few minutes, quote, the manager came back and told me his truck is still there and we called EMS. I can't tell you anything more, end quotes. Something was very wrong. Barnett's lawyers rushed to the hotel, believing John had suffered a heart attack, but what they found was something much more horrifying. According to the police, John Barnett had unalived himself in his car at around 9:30 that morning. His finger was still on the trigger of the gun, and a white note could be seen on the seat next to him. Police were called to the scene, and an investigation was opened into Barnett's death. The official results? That his death was self-inflicted. But that is literally all we know. Up until now, no details regarding Barnett's death has been made public. What was on the white piece of paper next to him? No one knows. What does the security footage of the hotel reveal about how, when, and why he did it? Or if he was alone? No one knows. The cops aren't giving anybody any details, which just makes everything seem even more suspicious. Why would Barnett agree to another day of questioning if he was planning on checking out early? Why would he extend his stay at the hotel? How could he have been in such good spirits the day before if this was what he was thinking about? And then there's the really big elephant in the room. Why would John Barnett tell a close family friend, quote, if anything happens, it's not, end quotes, just months before unaliving himself, right on the cusp of the lawsuit that finally stood to expose a $100 billion company that he spent the last 1.5 decades of his life fighting? Business tycoons in weaker countries assassinate people all the time. Is it that far-fetched that an American military industrial giant would do the same in today's America? You tell me. According to his family, even if Boeing didn't directly cause Barnett's death, they are still responsible.
Oh, yes. That would wear anybody down after, I don't know whether it's 7 or 8 years.
Something he endured constantly.
He wasn't trying to hurt Boeing. He was trying to save Boeing. He saw this coming, and he said at some point, this is all going to come down on Boeing.
Do you blame Boeing?
I think if this hadn't have gone on so long, I'd still have my son.
And in a sad twist of fate, just 2 days after John Barnett's death, at least 50 people were injured when a Boeing 787 Dreamliner took a sudden nosedive on a domestic flight in Australia due to technical failures. And on April 17, 2024, another Boeing employee, Sam Salapur, testified against the company on Capitol Hill, accusing it of overlooking significant defects in the name of production. And just like John Barnett, Boeing strongly denies Sam's claims and insists that none of the issues raised, quote, present any safety concerns, end quotes. No matter if Boeing was directly involved in his death or not, it's clear that John Barnett conveniently unaliving himself was the single greatest thing that could have ever happened to Boeing. And as of right now, it still doesn't look like the 787 Dreamliners have been fixed, so maybe try to avoid those flights for now like John Barnett advised. Before you book a flight, you can simply Google the flight number to see which airplane model it's on. And you want to know what else is super sketchy? Highways. Think about it, have you ever wondered why there are just so many highways in America and yet traffic is only getting worse and worse and worse and worse? Why do we continue building so many highways when there are so many better city layouts we can model from around the world? Who actually benefits from the construction of highways? Who's making all this money? Well, what if I told you that all these highways are part of an elaborate Ponzi scheme with you at the bottom of the pyramid? Well, we expose it all on a brand new channel called City Pulse that you can watch right now by clicking the card on the screen. This new channel is by another student of mine and it is phenomenal if you're into urbanism. So click the card on the screen to watch now and don't forget to subscribe.